to share in hopefully a wide-ranging discussion on why we do what we do at Emmanuel, specifically why we are continuing to play Bach on modern instruments, even though the prevailing trends in the music world have been moving much more towards a period practice and period instruments. So I'd like to introduce my colleagues. First of all, of course, Ryan Turner, Artistic Director of Emmanuel Music and Associate Director of the Bach Institute. Rose Drucker, violinist. Vanessa Holroyd, flutist. And Sarah Freiberg, cellist. They have been also contributing in various other ways to our institute, working with our students. And they all will have, I think, very interesting perspectives. So I want to start, I'm going to throw out some questions, and I don't think we need to necessarily go down the row. But I'm going to start by asking, what challenges do you face in playing Bach's music? So let me just put that out there and jump in, whoever wants.
Such an easy question. Well, I will say last fall I was asked to play piccolo cello here, which is a 5-string cello which Bach used both for his 6th suite and for a number of arias. And we have challenges in terms of what instruments we use, whether it's modern or Baroque, or what it was written for or what it wasn't written for in terms of instruments. I mean, most people who play keyboards play piano, and they play Bach on piano, and it has different possibilities than a harpsichord has, or an organ. And so what you play on matters in terms of what Bach is asking for. Sometimes you can do more than what he asks for on a so-called modern instrument, or not. There's a piccolo cello piece being done this week, impossibly hard on a 4-string cello, and our student cellist is doing an amazing job. But it becomes a different problem if you don't have quite the right instrument. So I'm just starting it off that way.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, I think Bach is sort of funny, at least for flutists. We start learning the whole sort of canon of repertoire in junior high school, and you start with the Bach sonatas, you start with the Bach partita, and you sort of learn one layer of it, and it's all about breathing and where on earth do you breathe, and then sort of there seems at first no place to breathe, and then sort of the more you delve into it. And I feel like, especially with the Bach sonatas, which is what I started, that was my first introduction to the music of Bach, was through his sonatas for flute. You sort of make one pass at them in high school, and then another pass at them in college, and then another pass at them in grad school, and then at some point you're like, oh, it starts to gel, and you're like, actually, there's tons of places to breathe if you just know what the sort of skeleton of the phrase is, and if you learn it. And so for me, I guess it's not so much a challenge, but just the process of learning Bach that I think it's really important to start early so that you have time to revisit it and revisit it and revisit it. There's not like a time when you're sort of ready for Bach. I think it's, you have to kind of let a lot of that go and be like, I'm just going to delve in and do one performance of it and then keep coming back to it. So by the time, I was, could get to playing the cantatas, you sort of have this like background or this experience of having done it in these other contexts. So I think for me, it's sort of a lot about the process of Bach that informs how I approach it.
Yeah, I'll jump on a similar thread from Vanessa, which is, as a violinist, you play the solo partitas and sonatas, and they're great, and they're, like Vanessa says, so many layers to them. There's the slow movements, you can learn all about slow phrasing, and then there's a fugue, which is impossible on a violin, except you have to make it work. So you learn about the voicing, and you learn about all these things that as a violinist aren't really on your plate when you're playing Tchaikovsky concerto. So I think Bach has just a wonderful learning tool, and learning phrasing and learning structure, and it's pretty massive what you can learn. And you do it in high school, and you do it in college, you do it in grad school, and you do it forever. So I still play Bach. I still play all these same pieces that I've been doing since high school. I found out about Bach cantatas, I kind of had no idea. I hadn't played a Bach cantata until I lived in Boston and started playing here, actually. I think I'd played a few other movements in different concerts, but I hadn't played a real cantata until I moved here. And then you have your experience playing this like much more complicated music and then coming and playing a chorale or playing an aria movement and just finding your place in an orchestral texture is great, and also just, you know, challenging. Matching singers as a string player, and Bach is all about singing, but the singers are also matching instruments. It's like a really back and forth kind of thing that we do. But I would say that there's, it's not one thing that's hard about Bach, but lots of challenges, but also just great, not just pedagogical in a boring way, but a lifelong learning process with Bach. But especially just the differences between, for each of our instruments, just what there is for our instruments to play. There's such variety and so many options. And I like how you said that you sometimes have more options on a modern instrument than you would on an older instrument. And also we don't know exactly even what they would have been playing on, like is what in Germany, in this town, in this year, you know, had they heard about these other kind of new bows? I mean, we don't really know, as the technology of the newer instruments spread across Europe, like exactly what people, so I think that they played on what they had, and that's kind of like what I like to think about. We play with what we have. So you have this instrument, you're gonna play it, and we kind of make it work in a way.
That's great, and I think, certainly want to give Ryan a chance to weigh in, but I think we're gonna come back to that question of the tools and the technology. So thank you for bringing that up. Ryan, did you want to?
Well, I'm going to let Pam talk about the challenges of approaching Bach as a singer. As a conductor, I will say the challenge is also the same thing that I relish, and that is the myriad decisions one has to make about what continuo group are you going to use? What's the affect? What's the character? What is the text telling you? How are you going to phrase something? Where is the articulation? I feel like the Bach's music, and in one way, is a blank canvas that allows so much creativity to come up, but at the other time, everything you need to know about it, he tells you. And it's sort of sorting out what that puzzle is and that mystery. And like you revisit the violin works through your whole life. I mean, as I've revisit cantatas and revisit passions and Christmas oratorios, the mystery is, I haven't solved it. And I think that's the challenge, and that's what makes us keep coming back to it.
So just to kind of tie together what you've all said, I think where we're starting is that the challenges that we all want to articulate are interpretive challenges, right? There's some technical things like, where do you breathe? Something Ryan hasn't mentioned, I know he will, is like balancing, like figuring out how something will sound right. I think that, yes, I have lots of opinions. I'm trying to decide where in this conversation I'll start sharing them. But, you know, in some ways what we've heard, all of us in the room who love Bach, I think are comfortable saying these challenges feel more serious with this composer than with other composers. But the thing is, that type of challenge exists with every composer. You know, learning that particular language, figuring out how phrases need to be directed, how we shape them. So I'd like to go a little deeper and ask to go into this question of the instrument, the tool that you're using. Because, you know, if you were to have a panel of entirely period players here, they would have said the same things about Bach. You know, it's this question of interpretation. So we haven't cracked the nut yet. Now I'd like to focus more specifically on this question of what might be different with the instrument that we are terming modern, as opposed to the instrument that we define as of Bach's time, or what we're referring to as period, right? So
I admit I left my Baroque cello at home. Somehow carrying 2 cellos in the cold looking for parking was just not appealing to me. Also, right now my so-called Baroque cello is ready to play Beethoven, so it's 10 cents lower than this, so it's at 430 pitch instead of 440. Together it's kind of not so good. But I can tell you what the sort of basic differences are. In fact, the odd thing is that my so-called modern cello is 10 years older than my Baroque cello.
Now that's going to be a question we're going to come back to.
So over the generations, we went from playing in beautiful big churches and in homes and perhaps for a prince or some sort of castle to playing in concert halls, really big. You had to project. You had a very different type of sound. And what we've done over time is actually the pitch in general has gone sharper. That makes it brighter, louder. It also puts more tension on strings. One of the things that they've done over time, and if I had the other cello you'd see, they've angled the neck back. And on my other cello, the neck is more straight up and down. Again, that puts more pressure on the instrument, more tension, makes it brighter, makes it louder. And probably the 2 other biggest things are what the strings are made of. These are made out of metal, all metal. And it really wasn't until the 1920s that we got rid of having gut. And I always say no cats were harmed, but sheep and cows were. So, gut strings, on the cello usually you have 2 pure gut strings, and on the top, the higher strings, and on the lower strings you have gut cores surrounded by some kind of metal, usually silver. And they have I think, a much sweeter sound. It's also much grittier. And particularly if you're right up close to it, you can hear the string speaking to you, kind of a kind of sound right under your ear. And they are very, very sensitive. And in fact, when I was in high school and I had an inability apparently to draw my bow straight, and also when I got up higher, if I was playing here and then playing here, I would leave my bow in the same place, but it turns out if you shorten the string, you also have to move your bow closer to your bridge or the sound is terrible. Well, it turned out that just having a gut A string on for about 3 months made everybody around me cringe, but it made me place my bow straight and start doing the things I had to do because I could hear it. These cellos let you get away, modern strings let you get away with murder. So that makes playing Bach a whole lot easier on a modern cello. So that's one thing. The other thing you may notice is what I'm doing right now is what I would do with a Baroque cello. This lovely thing called an end pin was the late 19th century invention. This allows me to have the cello not held by me, again, making it louder, brighter. So, big loud sound. Also, it allows me to vibrate a lot. If I'm playing this way and I vibrate, so does the cello. That's not so good. So I am kind of muffling the sound with my legs, but it's also more a part of me. So the other thing I wanted to talk about, and I think this is particularly important in Bach, is that the type of bow that Bach would have known was a bow that looked more like a bow and arrow bow. And I always get it mixed up. It's convex. This one caves in. And the convex bow, Baroque bow, has very different qualities at the front, what they call the frog, where your hand goes, and the tip. Because when you're right by your hand, you get a really nice sound. When you're at the tip, you get a beautiful diminuendo. Because the tip is just not so heavy. So it is great for playing Bach. It is wonderful. Like, it's so articulate, though. You just get this wonderful clarity. What it's really lousy at is playing like Brahms. You have to work so hard at the tip of the bow to do that. On a modern bow, the tip sounds great. But it's a little less easy to play that fast, articulate stuff that Bach asked for. And so what I have found is that the Baroque bow has helped me learn how to approach Bach. And then once I have the idea in my ear, I can then do something similar with the modern bow. And I wanted to play just a couple of examples, like if that's okay,
Yep.
That type of thing. Also, in the Baroque, people thought of music like speech. And so everybody learned oration. And everybody knew about sort of long lines. And the string players thought of their bows really as like a paintbrush. It was the way that they spoke. You speak through your bow. And now we do much more with our left hand and less with the bow, because the bow doesn't have as much articulation to it and as much variety, but it can. And so I feel like the Baroque bow has taught me much more about how to play Bach. So, I don't know, I just grabbed a couple of things from what we did in the fall. So this is a little passage from Cantata 180 that we did. And one of the things that Bach likes to do is he has these strokes where you have two or three notes on the elbows. You have going on the cello, it doesn't look down. On your violin, you go down and you go up. On the cello, you go down and up. But you have a short stroke. Much easier to do on a bow that's very light at the tip. So we had this little passage of that works very well. If I play that just the way my bow would like to play it as a modern bow, it'll all sound the same, and that's not a good thing. So suddenly the little note gets hit because the tip of my bow is strong. And then it sounds like you're putting accents on every word, and it's really annoying. So, but because I know how that sounds, I can sort of fight what my bow would like to do and make it sound more like that, I hope. And one of the things that you may or may not have noticed, I just noticed I was doing, because of the way that a Baroque bow is weighted from tip to frog, and we know from iconography, it's much more comfortable to hold it not actually at the tip, at the frog, at the very end of the bow, but you kind of choke up, they call it choking up, and you hold it here. And I just noticed that in order to get the sound that I wanted, I did the same thing on this bow. So you absolutely can make these bows and these instruments sing in a way that I find has been, for me, has certainly been taught through using the instruments of the time. But I feel like this stays in tune the whole time. I don't have to keep tuning it. And it's not as crotchety, you know. It's not going to squawk at me if I don't play my bow absolutely straight. So there's a certain freedom that comes with the modern instruments. And I think that the sound that we get and the way that we can explore sounds is almost infinite, no matter what we play with.
Right. So Rose, as a fellow string player, I'd love to hear from you next.
Yeah, agree, everything she said. But I think especially as an instrument that usually plays in a section, so there's 3 of us, 4 of us, maybe sometimes first and seconds play all together, so it would be like 8. If we all have instruments that are a little more consistent, if our strings are more matching, our instruments, our bows are just a little more consistent intonation, and I'm not going to say just because it's easier, but it blends better on a modern instrument. So modern strings, modern instruments are just a lot more similar and a lot more consistent. So if we all had older instruments with all of our different types of strings, and instruments have just kind of a lot, I think, a little more individual personality. Like older instruments can have a lot, I mean, it's just a different voice quality. And the gut strings, especially violin, gut E, is very interesting. And really hard to keep in tune. So I think it can be a beautiful sound, and especially in a solo, like I love hearing the solo sonatas and partitas on period instruments. I think it's fantastic. But as a section instrument, I think it's really easier and just kind of brings us more together to blend. And I think that's one thing, I think especially here at Emmanuel, we really like when all the violins are all playing together, and it's just this like special warm blended sound that we kind of do, that we like to do. And I don't know if that would be possible. And so the differences on a violin between a period instrument and modern are the same. The neck angle goes up, there's more tension, and it's a really interesting parallel. Can you just hold up your cello again? On like a Baroque instrument, where we would hold it would look just like this. We would go like that. They didn't have a chin rest here, and they also wouldn't have used one of these like mechanical looking shoulder rests. And I always, when I was younger, I was just like, how did they do that? And one thought, I mean, if I think about like Germany in the 1700s, it was really cold and people wore a lot more clothes. So I think they had a little more padding kind of just built in. Because it's quite difficult to keep a violin on your shoulder without extra. I mean, like my neck, a violin is only this thick. So something has to, unless you're crouched over like this. So Baroque instruments didn't have all that extra stuff. And it's sort of like what Sarah was showing. When she holds the cello with her knees, it does kind of dampen it a little bit. So when you're compressing the sides of the violin, it dampens its vibrations a little bit. So then as people wanted to play concertos and play louder, we built like a little chin rest that keeps your chin off the instrument, and then you built a shoulder rest that you can put on. So the violin is kind of suspended in between here, and the vibrations are a lot naturally bigger, but you can also vibrate. And it's the exact same with her. If you're holding the instrument here, your hand is actually helping to hold, so you can't vibrate as much. So that's where you get, I mean, like any of the big romantic concertos, we're vibrating every single note, and we're really blasting out the sound and really projecting. So it's the same evolution of sound and a way to hold your instrument that does more projection. So that's and the bow is the same difference. The bow is slightly like this for a violin. And she was showing down bow and up bow is just so interesting with cello and violin. So like, yeah, a down bow, my hand goes towards the floor. And it's the same issue. The down bows they start stronger and then they trail away a little bit as the bow gets lighter. So we would be fighting the same, same issues. But I think our choice is to use modern instruments. We can make it sound how we want. We're advanced enough as players that we can have the sound we want in our ear, and we can make our modern bow do what an older bow could do. I think that's one of the highlights, one of the reasons to play it on a modern instrument, but especially as a section instrument where we're trying to blend all of us together. I think it's just more consistent. Our instruments nowadays are just a little bit more similar, which is, good and bad. There's pros and cons to that, but.
Anyone else want to jump in on this? Talking about the specific tools and techniques of the instrument that you play, and how you use those features of the instrument to solve questions about the music.
That'd probably be me, right?
I think it's going to be you.
I'm the last one. Yeah, I mean, I think, it's an interesting question with Baroque flute, like the tools that would have been available to me at that time and the tools that are available now. In the sort of mid-1800s, the Bohm flute was sort of created, which basically evened out a bunch of things. And I debated about bringing my Baroque flute here because I'm not in Baroque flute shape at the moment. And so there's so many intonation issues with the Baroque flute. But then I thought, well, actually maybe just playing it completely out of tune actually kind of might represent, make my point, exactly. So, I mean, the tools that, this is modern flute that most people sort of recognize. Most of them are made of silver, gold, or some sort of combination. And the Baroque flutes obviously were made of wood, and they also varied a lot. I mean, lots of different kinds of wood, lots of different styles, different flute makers. Most of them sort of had this kind of four-piece format set up with one key. They're called the one-keyed flute. It's, nowadays it's really, like for me, a lot of the choice of playing on modern instruments, and I know we'll talk about it later, is a lot about accessibility and about making it possible for younger people or people just starting an instrument to be able to play Bach's music. And if you're only allowed to play Bach on a Baroque flute, that's going to exclude a lot of, band people. Maybe it'll save people from band. I don't know. One of the two things. But the challenge is, I mean, I've always felt like I always turn to Baroque recordings first when I'm trying to learn a cantata or listening to something or listening to a new piece, because I feel like it's a great place to start, to just sort of hear, okay, what was in Bach's, how did this music sound at that time? And I think there's a danger in using a modern flute and trying to really mimic it entirely. So for me, I always feel like I want to find some happy medium. I want to be as informed as possible, but then realize that I'm playing a modern flute and sort of celebrate the things that I can do on that instrument as well. One of, I think, the biggest differences that I've found between Baroque and modern is the variances of just individual notes. It's really striking that, an A sharp has a different fingering from a B flat, and they both sound very different. And when you're going through it, like just some notes or some pieces, depending on what key they're written in, sound totally different just because of the way the notes come out on this instrument. Telemann wrote these 12 fantasies for flute. You can play them on violin as well. But it's so interesting to hear them on Baroque flute because they each sound so different just because of the key that they're written. And again, with just apologies to legit Baroque players, and I'm just a tourist. But I love it, and I find it's fun to dabble, but it's, I can literally do like one measure for you, maybe, if I can get it. But it is interesting. This is pitched at 415, so it's going to sound lower than my other one. But it is really interesting to just hear a couple of the half steps or a couple of the chromaticisms and how it sounds on this flute as opposed to what gets sort of smoothed out on the modern one, if I can. We'll see. The fingering is also totally different, so unlike going between cello, it's such a mind trip because notes that I go to normally are not the notes. So notes like, or a B or an A sharp. It's such a different, and you have to sort of really finesse. Sometimes you want it to be, like the interval to be a little bit smaller than it normally would because it can have an expressive quality. So in that way, and I think Baroque players really relish in this, that you have, all of these colors that you can get, and you can make intervals smaller than they normally would be depending on what the phrasing is. And you have to work a little harder on that on the modern flute, where everything is kind of evened out. Which is louder and sort of open. So I feel like when I'm trying to interpret a cantata or play, the biggest compliment for me is if you can tell me I don't sound like a flute, or it doesn't sound like a flute or a flutist. That's my favorite, because it means that this process of trying to find the right color for the music has been somewhat achieved. And so the Baroque flute will give you a certain color. You're not going to get the same color on a modern flute. It's metal, it's louder, but I always try to just, I kind of open the sound. I try to get some like a wood metal sort of feel, and then try to think about the phrasing. And it's not like I'm going to be trying to, you know, do what a Baroque flute would between A sharp and B. It's going to be a wider interval no matter what, because it's just, there's nothing I can do. I can't sort of hedge it. But at the same time, I can sort of think, okay, but in this music, it would be a smaller interval, so maybe I won't, you know, maybe I'll dig in a little bit to it, or maybe I won't. There are a couple of other things that we're doing with the Bach Institute where, you know, it feels right for the phrasing to have one note have more weight to it or a darker color, and another note have, you know, a more transparent color, and that would happen naturally on a Baroque flute. And it seems right, and every time I sort of question it, like I went back and was playing some of the stuff from the Bach Institute on the Baroque, I'm like, that's why it felt right to not have a lot of emphasis or to have a darker color, because on the Baroque flute, this is a very bright, dark note, and on, you know, and this note is not a bright, dark note, it's a very unstable, transparent note. And so some of it you can kind of just interpret without even touching a Baroque flute, but I feel like it's really helpful to go back and forth or listen or just be informed by it, because that's what was, you know, I have to believe that Bach knew exactly what he was doing when he was writing for a lot of these instruments. He kind of knew, if I put this in this key, it's going to have a certain quality to it. If I put it in this key, it's going to be bright. If I put it in this key, it's going to be dark. So with the modern instrument, I think we have to just kind of be informed by that and that. Okay, I'm going to put these over here, put that down. So, but
yeah, I think homogenized is the word that comes
Yeah.
to my mind as to what the modern instruments are without knowing how much variety there can be. And I think the Baroque instruments
inform us and challenge us to make the modern instruments have that variety.
I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate here, because a premise that I hold is that Bach is not exactly like his contemporaries. This particular premise has become controversial. I think 50 years ago, there were very few people who would dispute that and say, well, of course, Bach is the greatest genius of music. Bach, you know, tells the notes what to do, blah, 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 all that kind of thing. And I think that there have been fascinating trends in scholarship that have tried to knock him off his pedestal a little bit and say he's more really a man of his time, and he's less this sort of universal, you know, supernatural genius. And I wouldn't call him supernatural. I think he's supremely human. But in my experience performing Bach, but also listening closely to Bach, I feel that Bach, while certainly knowing what he's doing and knowing his instruments really well, is often pushing instruments to places they don't want to go. Mm. And I think that it's not honest to say that if you put a Baroque instrument in your hand, you've solved all those problems. Mm. I think you don't solve those problems. In fact, you re-encounter them, right? So maybe one piece is in a flute key where all the inflections go exactly right, and maybe the next piece is in the place where all the inflections are exactly wrong. Mm. And that the flutist then has to work 3 times as hard to make the note that sounds closed to be the note that needs to be opened. Mm. I have my own theories about why he might do that, because it sounds very mean. Especially if you believe he really was so in control of his material. Why would he make his performers struggle? But I think all of you would agree that he does make us struggle, right? And therefore, when you look at Bach on the modern instrument, yeah, I mean, nobody wants to hear homogenized Bach. I mean, that's a really appalling concept. But I think that you don't answer the questions by making all the notes sound the same on a modern instrument, and you're not going to get the answer by playing it on a Baroque instrument either.
Correct.
It's just simply that you have to do the work, right? You have to do the thing that Vanessa started out by telling us about how she learned the sonatas at one level, and then she had to go back and learn them at a different level, and then a different level, and discover that he's asking her different solutions or asking different questions of her. So I think that I wouldn't want to have us leave tonight's panel thinking that, well, yeah, we do play modern instruments and we like them and these are our instruments, but gee, we wish we were playing Baroque instruments. I don't think that's true, right? And I think that the challenges that the music is posing are challenges that are going to be equally difficult and equally sophisticated, no matter what tool is in your hand. So just to make sure that, I mean, yes, I'm moderating. I'm also controlling a little bit. That we are coming back to that question of, you know, why are we embracing what we do on modern instruments, not just simply apologizing for it.
I like the challenge that I like that Baroque sort of takes you to hear the Baroque instrument flute, but I like the fact that with modern I can kind of maybe meet it halfway and then see where I can go with it. I do feel like with at least the Baroque flute, there's a point at which you can't go any more. And so for me, I mean, I'm not, obviously Baroque flute players would probably say differently, they can go anywhere. But I like the challenge of and having all of these different colors, more colors and more things that I can do on a modern one, and how can I answer more of these questions with, apply it to Bach and take it further.
I mean, also we can't just, for us, erase all the music that came after Bach. And as an organization, we play new music also. We play Bach, and there's always something else brewing, right, at Emmanuel. So if we were just tied down by period instruments, we wouldn't also be playing Stravinsky or Harbison or can't even think of all of the other composers we regularly do. So a Baroque only would be limiting us in a way as an orchestra. But then, as I love your point, I mean, handing me a Baroque violin is not going to make like the C major fugue easy at all. Like there are some things about it that are easier. You can grab the chords a little bit easier, but it's not going to solve it. Yeah. So I think that's just an excellent point.
I will. No, you should. Quick thing. One thing, we can come back to it later. I realize we do use recorders, so I want to say like that is a very important thing to consider within the mix, which I love. I love that Emmanuel uses recorder at modern pitch when it's appropriate, when it's called for in a cantata, instead of replacing it with modern flute, because it is a very unique timbre, and especially the sopranino recorder. And I think it is important. I mean, that's a good choice that I think is made, is to keep, we're bringing, I mean, technically that's a period instrument, but at the same time, it's I think, a really important color to retain and to have. Just wanted to put in a recorder plug for that.
I hope our recorder player is watching right
Yes, exactly. Just making sure that's said.
I just want to say one thing in that, so I teach a course each spring at BU on Baroque cello for modern cellists. And these cellists like me grew up, they're now college, graduate students, whichever, playing the Bach cello suites, and probably, they started with the first cello suite that everyone knows, and Yo-Yo Ma started on his viola with an end pin at the age of 3. The first thing he ever learned was how to play that piece, that first movement. I don't let them play Bach until the end, because I think that we really need to remember how amazing Bach was in context. And there was nothing like the Bach cello suites. We still don't know who he wrote them for, why he wrote them. There was some solo cello music that came out of Bologna and Modena, because they came up with thinner strings that could be mean that you could have smaller instruments because the original cellos were really big and they were only thought of as bass accompanying instruments. And suddenly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there was this little flurry of activity of music written for this new, smaller instrument that it could be a solo instrument. But it was a very different language from Bach. And I try to make sure that people remember when they get to Bach, what an achievement that is. And it is still really hard. And it's really hard when you have equipment that you're not comfortable with, and you've learned certain bowings, and you've learned certain fingerings, and suddenly you're supposed to be playing open strings, and it's a different language, but it's a different language from what came
before. And I think it's really good for us to just keep remembering Bach is really special.
Yeah. One of the things that I always think about is Bach was always pushing the demands of his instrumentalists and the instruments, and was, quite frankly, on the forefront of sort of introducing new instruments to his congregation. The corno di caccia, which we think of now, the modern equivalent would be an English horn, was probably the first time it was heard in Saxony in the 18th century, was in St. Thomas Kirk. The number of different recorders he used. We know, post his sort of cantata writing career, the keyboard instruments that he was exploring. I have to think that what we do at Emmanuel is exploring what are the options of the instruments in the same way Bach would. If you gave Bach a modern violin, I mean, what an image to see Bach with a modern violin and figuring out what could I do with this thing,
Even harder.
Yeah, and one of the things that Vanessa said, and also Sarah said, is this idea that I like to think of what we do here is historically informed performance, but not in the traditional sense, because Vanessa will go to her Baroque flute and figure out how this sounded, how did it feel. You do it on your Baroque cello. I'm sure you think about what would it have felt like to play this passage with a Baroque bow, and it informs the way we do this on a modern instrument. But that's just the beginning. It's not the limit. It's a little information, and then what I think Bach would have done is explore what are the absolute, how far can we stretch the possibilities of color with this instrument, with all these instruments, and then you put them all together. When we have a situation like we had last week, where we had English horns and recorders and horns, which sounds like it was such an exotic sound that Bach was able to come up with, and we were able to not only replicate it, but sort of create it anew in our modern terms here. Another point that was made, that Rose made, is that, Emmanuel, of course, while our mission and our focus and our true passion is Bach, and what can we do with Bach, and what does Bach teach us, we do many other composers as well. And if we were limited by the period instruments, there's so much that we wouldn't get to do. Especially our principal guest conductor, and without John Harbison, I don't know where we'd be, especially without his music. And the final thing I'll say that is part of, as I look at our Bach Institute fellows here, but anyone who's in a high school or college conservatory program, and I think you mentioned this, if all they had were Baroque instruments, they would never be exposed to the wonders and challenges of Bach. And it's not something at the level at which, at least with the Bach Institute or what we do here at Emmanuel, that students aren't exposed. I mean, you said you were how old? I mean, you were out of college when you first played a Bach cantata.
Correct.
If we were limited to just period instruments, I mean, this is not the domain of historical performance world.
Right.
This is the domain of all musicians, and I think that's the beauty of this music, and it stretches all musicians' limitations and imagination.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure this was the point I was especially thinking of. If we could only play Bach on this specific correct instrument, it would sort of maybe stay in a more niche. It would be a smaller amount of people could play it. It would be a specialized thing, and we have those in Boston. We actually have lots of that. You'd have no
problem finding plenty of musicians to play it, but it'd be in this like sort of limited world and a specialized music world. So if you can have any instrumentalist, like any violinist, sure, you can play Bach, like that it's available to us to play, and that it's not as limited. And you sort of said a point about access and accessibility, and everyone should be able to do it because the music is there for everyone.
Can I make one more point, sort of agreeing with that?
That we have this amazing stable of musicians here at Emmanuel Music, and each week there are different players, and they all bring different things, and it's so wonderful. You know, not all of us play every week, but we get to know how each other play. And I mean, I play in an early music orchestra. Yeah, I'm embarrassed to say, but we don't have that stable. I mean, we have to bring people in from all over the country. You know, we don't have all the great trumpeters here all the time who can play natural trumpet. And you know, our principal horn player comes from Pennsylvania, and our principal flutist comes from New York, and our oboist comes from Ohio. I mean, it's just we have this wealth of performers. It's such a treat. So.
And I think, just pick up something I think Ryan certainly want to talk about, just in practical terms. We're putting a cantata on every week. And there are so many issues with that, simply contracting people, but also we can't pay the kinds of fees to put on a piece with 2 oboes da caccia. You know, what we would have to pay to bring those musicians here to then do Cantata 65, that would have to be a concert where we would be selling tickets at a very high premium in order to fund it, right? So there's certainly, you know, large practical questions about the feasibility of being able to put a cantata on every week if you don't have the experts, the specialists who can come in. But I also think that, I'm going to go back to my point, because one of the reasons this panel discussion is happening is because the world has turned upside down in a way in about 20 years. So 20 years ago, if you were looking for recordings of Bach, most of them would be on modern instruments at modern pitch, what we call modern pitch, which is A equals 440-ish, right? If you're not sure what that means, just hang on to the fact that the number is 440. And then the Baroque instruments, as Vanessa mentioned, are pitched lower, so she said 415, so that just simply means it's a half step below the modern pitch. Now, if you go to look for a recording of Bach, all over the
They're
internet,
all Baroque. Yeah.
they're pretty much all Baroque recordings. That's remarkable, and I think it's a good thing, right? What it represents is, first of all, in about 20 years, the virtuosity, the skill, just simply the numbers of people who have become expert on their instruments has grown to such a degree, and been able to field these multiple ensembles who play Bach on Baroque instruments and are handing us this new sound, right? And it's remarkable. Every single one of us has benefited from learning from the sound, working with that sound. Ryan and I have both sung with Baroque orchestras multiple times. But I just want to drop that note of skepticism in there, because Sarah said something about homogenization. And to me, there's a danger in Bach practice when you simply say, I'm holding the right instrument in my hand, therefore everything the instrument chooses to do must be right. And I think that there are performances out there that stop at that point. And I want us as a community thinking about what it means to play Bach to say, no, you can't leave it there. Not every note that you start on a down bow naturally wants to taper.
Yeah. No, it doesn't.
There are going to be notes that you're going to have to fight like mad to make the end of the note as strong or stronger, right?
Yeah.
And the opposite is true. The bow is not going to solve all your problems. The closed and open notes on the flute are not going to solve all your interpretive problems. And that is a thing that I feel we in Emmanuel are trying to hold a beacon and a banner for. Let's interrogate this music. Let's try to figure out what's really happening in the music, and then whatever we've got, let's throw it at the solution.
Yeah, I think also that we're not using these sort of like, well, this is the Baroque rule. This is how you phrase these notes always. Like, we're not doing those rules. We don't have those. Which means that, like, oftentimes there's a discussion, like, how much are we doing the slur? How much are we clipping the slur? But it's good. It means we're not just sitting in this little boxed-in rule guide, like, oh, Baroque music says blah, 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 you do this way. So I think that's exactly your point. We're not doing that. We kind of, everything's about context, about the text usually is where it comes from, I think, and what the singers are doing, what the chorus is doing, and it's all one big thing that we kind of decide, I mean, with Ryan's direction, but also together. And then, you know, sometimes the violin section has to just magically do the same thing without talking about it. And we do. We don't have to talk about it a lot of the time. And sometimes we talk about it, and it's great, but it's just, it's exactly what you said. We're not just following a rule, like, oh, the Baroque instruments do it this way. It's the whole world of possibilities.
Right.
One of the things that I always think about too, and you sort of mentioned this in passing, Pam, is one of the jobs that I get to do is try to figure out how all these instruments talk to each other in a way, and how do we balance, and how do we make it work that the text is coming through, and in the challenges of a sanctuary the size that we have, which is at times acoustically glorious and at times acoustically frustrating, and acoustically misleading. If we created what we wanted to on the chancel with the instrumentalists, if we created the musical phrase that we all wanted to play, and you step outside and listen to it, it would be a glorious sound, and it would be without a lot of character. Reminds me of Man in the Mountain in New Hampshire when its nose fell off. It would have no profile. It would be without anything etched, you wouldn't hear text. So a lot of what I have to do is I step out and I listen, and we try to make minor modifications in articulation and space and phrasing to make stuff happen. And I say all this because I think it's important whenever we listen to a recording that's a studio recording on Baroque instruments, all these things have been micromanaged in a way to make it sound like this is the way it's supposed to be, and that everything balances perfectly. And that, in truth, is not the case, depending on what acoustic you're in. I mean, we could do it here, and then we could, let's say, we went up to Chelou in Rockport, which we've done, and do a concert there. It's a whole different host of issues we're dealing with and adapting to. So, yes, the instruments can tell us a lot, but they're not going to tell us how to balance things. We're using modern voices.
Yeah.
And pitch doesn't solve any of that either. I think that's something we haven't talked about. You know, a lot of times I'll hear singers say, oh, this was just down a half step at 4:15. Sure, maybe there'd be some notes that are easier to play, but there'd be others, I mean, just saying other ones that would be a lot harder. And we can explore the capacities of the voice, depending on what pitch we're at and how, I think I'm looking at Nolan here as a fellow tenor, thinking about where the passaggio lies and what the challenges are of it and how our own vocal training has changed since the 18th century. I can't imagine us going back to what we think people perhaps sang like in the 18th century, what the vocal training was like. I would never ask a singer to do that. So I certainly can't imagine asking an instrumentalist to play in the same way. You're informed by it, but you don't necessarily use that same technique as was used then.
And there are impossibilities. There are things we can't know. I thought that what Sarah said about her two cellos and the fact that her modern cello is how many years older?
It's 10 years older
10
than
years
my
older.
so-called Baroque cello, which is actually classical.
Now, I don't mean to indict the expert skill of the instrument builders, you know, because the modern, excuse me, the Baroque period instrument movement has depended on incredible craftspeople creating instruments in our century, in our decades, that are modeled on old instruments. There are very few actual period instruments that people can play on. I mean, imagine how incredibly valuable that would be.
Well, and the instruments, a lot of the soloists play instruments that...
At the time, what instruments have become modernized. So people are playing on an instrument from the 1700s, and they're playing the Brahms concerto, or they're playing contemporary new works on it because they've been modernized over time. So they're just additions to the basic same instrument. You can change the neck, you can change the inside parts. There's all these little bits inside that help project the sound and do all these stuff. So people are playing instruments from that time. They're actually playing instruments from the 1700s, 1600s even. I mean, but those instruments have been modernized. So if you want to play an actual Baroque instrument, you can take one of those and take all the stuff apart and redo it, but that would be, no one's going to really want to do that. So we have a lot of...
You don't know what it might sound like.
And exactly.
If you have an instrument
That's modernized and it sounds good. You don't know what it will sound like if you try to retrofit it.
Exactly.
So for instance, Stradivarius, right? He was a maker from the 1700s, but every Stradivarius that we've ever heard played has been changed, and no one would ever touch such an instrument to put it back here. I think there are very, very rare.
There's a few left that didn't get modernized.
And I will say, so my Baroque cello was never modernized. Now, usually what happens is the instruments that people really like, they just keep modernizing them because they want to play them. And so usually people figure that the instruments that didn't get modernized must be bad. My cello was bought at auction in London. Both my cellos are English. And the person who ended up selling it to me had a book of the English cello, or English violins actually, and it had a picture of my cello, which has like a splash of something on it. It's very obvious that that was my cello. It was set up modern at some point. It had never been modernized. So the neck was not right. If you had got steel strings on an instrument that wasn't meant to have them, it probably was not very happy. And so in the book it said, well, his instruments don't sound very good. And I imagine it really didn't, because it was set up the wrong way. And so it sort of, once it got strings back on and we put the right bridge on, a tailpiece, and it's glorious. I love it. But you have to have the right, you have to have the right way to have the instrument. This instrument sounds wonderful the way it is. And I couldn't imagine taking the neck off and putting a different one on in order to bring it back. Yeah.
But I'm gonna inject another negative, skeptical little thing into the pool here, which is that what we're hearing from the Baroque orchestras is a thoroughly modern aesthetic. It's a created aesthetic that is coming from the tastes of the players, what pleases them, the makers, because the makers are all contemporary, and what seems to kind of be a synergy between audiences and players. It's like we like it to be this way. So the next time you listen to a Baroque recording, remember that what you're listening to is as thoroughly contemporary, as thoroughly 21st century as what you might hear in Emmanuel. It's not a magical recording from the 18th century, right? We really can never know what that sounded like. And in fact, I think some of us who play or work with a lot of Bach imagine that it probably sounded pretty awful because the music was so difficult and the players had never encountered anything like it. And he had so little time to rehearse things that it's really hard to imagine that some of the niceties that Ryan's talking about, balance, tuning, ensemble. So you know, this becomes a whole other question about performing Bach.
Yeah, I think it's really funny sometimes to imagine what it was like at the time. If Bach was like, oh, so-and-so, some friend is coming in from
wherever and they play this instrument, so he's writing this cantata, or someone shows up who's obviously a great violinist who's like, oh, here, play this aria. And I mean, we don't rehearse a lot at Emmanuel. It's pretty fast-paced, but we do get the music in advance. And so if there's a solo aria coming up, I get some notice and I can play it. But I just kind of love imagining like waltzing into town, oh, hey, your buddy Bach is going to play this. And he puts down some just ridiculously hard solo aria and it's freezing and it's cold because, right? Wasn't everyone freezing? I mean, I can't imagine moving my fingers and on those strings. I mean, it just seems really hard, but also funny to me. I kind of think, when I think about that, I'm like, okay.
And I mean, we're all used to
Modern editions.
Right.
And Bach wrote, I mean, he wrote beautifully, but, you know, if you have to write quickly for this week's cantata, and you're in a dark church that doesn't have lighting.
And you've never had any other composer ask you to play, you know, B sharp and, you know, F flat and all these things that we know he's asking us to play.
One of the things that, in my mind, I've always thought is that Bach was, I use the verb emancipated from a paying audience, the demands of a paying audience. He was, for their cantatas I'm talking about, or the, you know, major, the Passions, oratorios, B minor is a different thing, because that was an audition piece.
Yeah.
That's a very different thing. But he had a captive audience that really, they had nowhere else to be, quite frankly, at the time. But, so he had this incredible opportunity. People weren't buying tickets. It wasn't like Handel, who was existing financially by the box office. If it did well, he did well. If it didn't, he was in financial trouble. Bach pushed so many limits because he had, in the sense that he had such stability as a composer and as a performer. And he had people that, I mean, they basically had to be there. Nobody was applauding, as far as we know. So when I think about what we do at Emmanuel, or what we do at any church that has this incredible opportunity to present this music in a setting similar, not exactly like, but similar to what Bach had, with people that are willingly there. They're not paying a ticket price. There's no applause afterwards, and what we have the opportunity to do is to challenge, explore, and push the expressive limitations of this music and what it means, and not just the expressive limitations, but what is the getting into our own psychoses about it, and digging deep. And we're not trying to please the congregation, if I may be that bold. This is about figuring out what this music means to the soul. And that's one of the great gifts of doing it at Emmanuel, and doing it on modern instruments means that our expressive palette is that much greater, because the instruments can do a lot more. There are things they can't do, but as you say, we've learned how to make them replicate what we think might have happened. But when you talk about a recording being a 20th, you know, Baroque recording being a 20th century or 21st century concept, that's driven by market forces, which we aren't. I mean, I think even our musicians could say they're not driven by market forces given what we pay them.
A theme that Ryan knows that I always like to come back to is, again, thinking about how things work on a particular instrument. You know, what does the Baroque flute like to do? What keys does it like to play in? What registers does it sound good in? And you will find, if you think of a composer like Handel, who worked with great musicians, but was, you know, needing to be able to put something out there that was going to be effective. It was going to really have punch and work. He's relying on the skills of his his players to use everything they know to put it together. And so you can feel the music of Handel, the music of Vivaldi, the music of Telemann, a lot of these great, great composers from the 18th century writing in a way that exploits what the instruments do. Bach, on the other hand, will be as likely to, subvert what the instrument wants to do. He might ask the flute to play only in the low register and balance it against an instrument that's going to completely wipe it out. Ryan and I have shared many examples of places where singers are buried under instruments, and Ryan, in his incredibly skillful way of thinking as a conductor, is always trying to solve that. Let's make the instrument more transparent because we need to hear the singer. And I've sometimes said to him, maybe that's not what Bach wants. Maybe what Bach wants is for the listener to go, wait, I can't hear the singer. And they have to lean in. They have to follow the voice into this void, into this hole, and maybe that's exactly what he wants. He wants you not to sit back and say, oh, that's so beautiful. As if you're not involved, right? I'm always finding ways that Bach is tricking the listener out of their complacency. And he does it in a lot of ways. He does it in strange harmonies. He does it in timings or odd phrases. But I think this idea of making the instrumentalists or the singers work very hard is a way of making the listener work hard too. I'd like to say, and I think this is going to sound very prideful, that you would only discover that kind of thing if you get to do Bach for so many years. And you over and over again encounter these works, whether it's you performing or listening to your colleagues perform, you go, why is that like that? And then you eventually realize, but I was really compelled by that. I was fascinated. I was disturbed by it. I had an emotional reaction. And then I finally realized maybe that was the point. That's what the composer wanted.
I think of the fifth of the Bach cello suites, which Bach asks for the top string, which is normally an A, to be tuned down to G. And so you have a G string, D, another G, and a C. And that makes for a very resonant instrument, particularly in the key of C or G, because you've got all these strings getting really excited every time you play that note on a different string. It's also very cool because it's called scordatura when you mistune strings. But when he shows the player the notes as you would normally see them. So if you see a note that's supposed to be on what was the A string, he calls it an A, even though the string is now a G. If he wants a G to be played on the next string over, he says it's a G. It's one of the only places where we actually know his fingerings, because he tells you which string he wants you to be on. But what I realized, because a lot of people they don't want to have to retune the instrument for one piece, is he was just exploring the sound quality, the possibilities. And he does this first movement that's a French overture, which means you start with this big slow section, and then you have a fugue on a one-voiced instrument, which is always exciting to do. But the sounds that come out of that, it teaches you so much about him as just his incredible ability to come up with things. He was exploring all the time. And the more that we can do that exploration, the more we learn too, and can share.
I think it's interesting that now that I've been here a few years, cantatas are coming around again. And so the sort of second or third time you play, what I love is it just seems like there's an infinite number of combinations of players. So, I mean, different vocalists, different instrumentalists, but I feel like when I've had the privilege of playing a cantata or an aria, I should say, more than once. It's usually with a different singer, and the fact that there are always different choices to be made. Or I'll look at what I wrote last time and I was like, I'm going to make different choices this time, different choices for breathing, different. I mean, some of them are the same, because obviously you're sort of, the music is serving the text and text serving the music. So there's some things that are sort of consistent, but depending on, is it a younger singer that's sort of singing it for the first time, or is it someone that's more seasoned, that's sung it, a few times? It's a different quality, and it lends itself. There's room for those differences and those different types of interpretations. And I haven't really found another composer, and granted the flute repertoire is not as vast as other instruments' repertoire, but I really haven't found another composer where the music really lends itself to the degree of different interpretations or different questions to ask or different sort of things, while having that consistent, I don't know, it's this amazing balance between room for exploration and difference and variety and continuity, and which is very comforting as well. So it's been a really interesting practice to sort of have the opportunity to play some of these arias multiple times and just see what happens each time. I don't know, it's interesting.
I think it's also really interesting to see the entire history
of Emmanuel music in the scores, because some of these parts have been played numerous times over the last half century, and the markings change all the time, and you look at the cello part and then you look at the bass part, and they have totally different things in them, and people who've just been scribbling all the time. It's like you've got living history, and it's really cool.
I was going to mention exactly that when every rehearsal.
Right. When we start changing bowings, and it's like, well, what did we do last time? Why aren't we just doing the same thing? And it's because it's different. It's a different thing. It's a different moment. And so it's not a problem. I think one of the last ones we did, and you're like, oh, these parts are old, I should look through them again. It doesn't matter. Every time we do it, it's going to be different. So even if we liked what we did last time, there's different decisions. It's almost infinite number of choices you could make. But I love when it's my handwriting from probably 10 years ago, and I kind of don't remember whatever moment led to that decision. I don't know, but I'm like, yeah, I obviously thought that should be different. Sometimes it's completely opposite. But yeah, the parts come around, and it's pretty fun.
I would love to open it up to the floor. I'm hoping that we've intrigued you and brought some interesting points up. So please go ahead and pose your questions to us. It feels like you really want to speak, so please do.
As we know, there are accomplished and polished and serious performing ensembles in Boston and far beyond that have deep commitments to period instruments. So my question is, what of musical value are they omitting or leaving on the table during, let's say, a live performance, not micromanaged in the studio?
I was expecting more to that question. So you say...
Well, we've heard a lot about the value of using contemporary instruments. For an organization that does not, that uses only period instruments, what is lost?
What are they sacrificing?
Yes.
Well, I would say, since I play in Pamela Dellal, we play in Symphony Hall. We shouldn't. So, I don't know. Maybe I should. But so much is lost of the subtleties of the quieter instruments in a big hall. And, I love that I play in a small section. 3 cellos is plenty for me. It's not plenty for Symphony Hall. So, next week last week we played a Beethoven Symphony, next week we're playing a Beethoven Symphony, 4 cellos, not 12. And to me, finding the right place to play is really hard around here. I mean, we're playing in one of the best halls in the world, and I wouldn't give that up but I just think that it doesn't show us at our best advantage. That may not be the answer to the question.
Well, no, that's certainly an answer, but I would come back with another question. If I understand correctly, his cantatas were performed in churches, which are not in salons, not in somebody's living room. So those were too big also.
Not in the same way, I don't think. Depending on the church, of course. You're not trying to reach 3,000 people at the back of the hall. You're giving your glory to God, and hopefully people are taking, they're thinking about it in a different way than you making a performance to try and get out to an paying audience. I think that's part of it. And I mean, we've done occasionally cantatas in Hannover and passions and things. But you lose something when it's not in a church, I think.
So I'm not going to ask you a million more questions, but I do have one more. Again, these ensembles that are deeply committed to period instruments, if they perform live in a, let's say, a right-sized space, what are they leaving on the table of reasonable value?
I'm just going to take a little of that, and I don't believe that I feel that they are necessarily leaving anything on the table. I think that they're amazing musicians who have dedicated themselves to their instruments and pushed themselves to make their instruments as responsive as possible, which is a great deal more 20 years on from where they were in 2000 and in the previous century, meaning 20th century. In the 20th century, which I was definitely a citizen of, unlike some of you guys, period instruments were often sort of regularly out of tune. And there was a mindset, it was fascinating, that there was a mindset that sort of made that a virtue. It's so raw. You remember? Right? And the sort of ungainliness of the sound. Because everything was so new and it was so exciting to discover a different way to hear so much of this music that there was a lot of rationalizing about the way it sounds, the way these players who have picked up these instruments and became quite good, but again, not at the level of what we're hearing now. It was a lot of apologists. It's like that must have been what it was, right? If we listen to some of those recordings from like the 80s, 1980s, it would be shocking compared to the sophistication of what we hear in 2022 or 2023. And that, to me, again, is this modernist aesthetic. That an aesthetic developed around the way the instruments were being played in the 1980s. And that aesthetic has been left behind, and there's a new aesthetic. And the new aesthetic is wrapped around the much better control that the players have developed, especially the wind players, who now play with a much more subtle color and unbelievable control of pitch. I mean, especially when you think of brass players, right? So I have incredible respect for those musicians, and I think that they play like we do. They search for every nuance. They do everything that they can possibly do to play Bach, right? The only thing that I would say that they leave on the table, which is a completely spurious answer, is they don't have Peggy Pearson. And that means that the individual artist with the voice, like, let me turn that around and say, they don't have Yo-Yo Ma. Yo-Yo Ma doesn't play Baroque cello. Would any of us want a world where Yo-Yo Ma never played Bach? Right? So those orchestras are not impoverished by not having Yo-Yo Ma play in their orchestra. And they're not impoverished by not having Peggy Pearson play. But the world would be poorer if no one allowed Peggy Pearson to play Bach. So that's the difference, I think.
I want to say one thing about recordings and Yo-Yo Ma. The Bach Bach cello suites are endlessly fascinating to all cellists. And Yo-Yo Ma has recorded them countless times because they mean something different to him all the time. And the fact that we have recordings means that we can share in his insights at different periods in his life. And I think that's really wonderful.
Especially the earlier one.
Compared to the later is a huge difference. I really like listening to them kind of back to back and comparing. Yeah.
I think that's an excellent point. I think it's, what we're getting is, I feel like, at least from my window, it seems like there was a sort of camp of things have to be performed on period instruments for it to be legit, you know, or it has to be this way or not, or why would you not do it if you weren't using the actual instruments? And I think it's just creating space and creating room for different interpretations and allowing a world where I can play Bach or Peggy Pearson can play Bach, you know, that we all can have it. So, I mean, I think just to make sure that that's not the only thing, then you are leaving something behind by not having it.
You know, also, I will say that we also use gambas.
Yeah.
And we have done performances, I remember one specifically, we did a Pargalese Stabat Mater in the Lindsay Chapel on Baroque violins once. There happened to be two players that we hired who also played Baroque violin, and I said, hey, let's try it. I think you play that. Yeah, and it just so happened that all the players had that hardware. And we said, let's give it a shot, let's explore and see what it's like. So what I'm just saying is that I feel like at Emmanuel we're holding up what we do, but not, it's an and not an or, and it's not to the detriment of the other things. I mean, as a performer, I probably did a lot more performing with Baroque orchestras than modern orchestras, with the exception, of course, doing cantatas at Emmanuel as a performer. So I'm not here to make a value judgment on either. I think that I hold them both up, and we have the benefit of modern instruments here in which we also get to do other repertoire. And we learn from each other.
One other thing I want to mention is that 20 or 30 years ago, modern orchestras got scared about doing the music that now the early music people have taken from them. You know, we shouldn't do Bach because supposedly we don't know how to do it.
Right.
And the understanding of that early music playing and style has seeped into modern players, and I think everybody benefits from it. And I think modern orchestras play Bach pretty well now, in a very different style than they did 50 years ago.
Right. And using also the gifts that they still possess.
Yes.
Are there any other comments, questions? Wes?
I hate to broach the topic, but keyboard. As a keyboardist, I find it more striking the difference between playing, let's say, Bach on piano versus organ versus harpsichord versus clavichord. And they can all teach us so much about the music, and they all have their challenges and attributes. But I'm curious what it's like performing with, let's say, a violin sonata with harpsichord versus with piano, which is not often done now. And how in an ensemble like this, along with recorders, it's one of the few instruments that we haven't moved it into the modern one. We're not doing continuo on piano.
Yeah.
You know, I actually have heard a recording of the Bach Magnificat with piano on the recording. It was very interesting.
Yeah. What about
Well, I mean, playing, of course, we did the
Lindsay Chapel series of the violin accompanied sonatas, so sonatas with a keyboard instrument, and I played one, and just the thought of playing it with a piano, I can't imagine, actually, even though I wasn't playing on a Baroque instrument. So it's such an interesting point that we keep the harpsichord in its original, like that's still the harpsichord. I don't think that's changed. I mean, the harpsichord is still a harpsichord, but now I'm playing a modern instrument, but I'm playing a Bach sonata with. So that's a really interesting concept and an interesting question. I hadn't thought too much about it just because I take it for granted. Like, of course, we're going to play it with the harpsichord, but yeah,
Because it's a huge access thing too. I mean,
yes.
as a harpsichordist, I only got a harpsichord
a few years ago, and so before that, I wasn't really a harpsichordist yet.
Right.
I was interested in harpsichord, but if you want to play organ, you have to have $30,000 to buy an organ.
I think that's such a good point. It's just all the equipment. I mean, especially if you're a keyboard player, are you supposed to have 4 different keyboard instruments in your, wherever, small apartment or somewhere? Am I supposed to have especially, cellos are bigger, but if I wanted to be comprehensive, 4 different bows. I mean, as you trace the evolution of the bow, I don't actually.
Yeah, she does. So. I do want to just make a point that I think is really important, and this is the way I see it. I think the what we're calling the Baroque violin and the modern violin, these are, direct generation relatives. The piano and the harpsichord are not relatives, right? It's a completely different mechanism, and which is why, and the organ is the organ, right? The organ, you put it in gear with keys, but that's the only thing about it that it resembles, right? And it came up in passing that the viola da gamba was a precursor to the cello. It is most emphatically not, right? The viola da gamba is an instrument unique and has its own family, and the recorder is in no way a precursor to the flute.
No, and don't say that to any recorder player.
So when we do Bach, when it designates recorder,
Yeah.
that's what, I don't know what else,
Has to be.
what else you do it on, because it's got rid of the flute.
Yeah. Correct.
There was another question?
Yeah, mine. I'm going to follow up with this gentleman's line of questioning was here in the front row, and pose a hypothetical here as well, and throwing every legitimate accessibility concern, every other incredible thing that you all have brought up as a reason why Emmanuel does what it does. The one thing that we can probably say is the difference between what we call 440 and 415 is that timbre that comes with it. And I was wondering if there was if there would ever be a consideration for saying, the challenges of performing this at 415 versus 440 are maybe less, or they're different in a way that we can accommodate on a particular Sunday, that we would perform this at 415 instead of 440.
I'll answer that. No. There are simple practical reasons.
No, yeah.
Even if, we have that organ transposes, but the tuning's, the temperament's going to be different. The tuning's different when you move the organ. It's not going to be in tune. I would never ask Rose to tune her violin down. I have to scoot over even thinking about it. Now, having said that, Sarah has played numerous cantatas on a Baroque cello tuned up. Often it's a practical thing because she might be going to, that's the only cello she has with her.
Yeah.
She's off to go play an HH gig. There are just those practical things. So I suppose it's not fair that I wouldn't ask you to tune down, but I always ask you to tune up.
Yeah. Well, and actually, a few weeks ago, I had a concert in Lindsay Chapel right after rehearsing here. And this organ got brought down and then retuned for that concert, and then got moved back on my Sunday. It had been tuned back up. But for that particular cantata, my playing the rehearsal on the Baroque cello at 440, it just sounded wrong. Most of them it doesn't. That cantata I really needed to play on my modern cello. So when I came back the next day, I left the Baroque cello at home.
The other thing to add to that, there are a number of cantatas too that we, especially the earlier cantatas, that we have scores that are in different pitches. Cantata 106, Actus Tragicus is one of them. There's the E flat key and there's the F key. It depends on the recorders, it depends on the singers. When we think about that, I always think of the bass singer first. You almost need two different singers because one of the arias, Stella Van House, has a low E flat, and then the next aria, Paradis, they've got to sing a high A flat. And this is not the same singer. So, I don't know if I'm completely answering your question other than to say I would not ask a modern player to tune down. It's never anything that's crossed my mind. We've used Baroque instruments at times, and we've used different keys changing the pitch. It's also just not practical from week to week for our organ to make those shifts.
And for the whole orchestra to tune.
To the organ. I mean, it's already kind of a problem. Sometimes it's cold and the organ is not warm yet, so it's a little low. And so we're all kind of trying to tune a little low. And so just it's like a sort of an in the cracks kind of.
And you'd be limited to recorders, because they're the only people I know that would have probably a 415 instrument. None of the modern winds would be able to get that low.
Right.
So you'd lose oboes, flutes, brass. So as long as it was just strings.
Just strings.
That's why when we did that was the reason we did the
Yeah.
Panelists. I think we might have got Actus Tragicus once at a different pitch.
Yeah.
Because it was Gama's organ and then two recorders.
Right.
And violin, I think you played it.
I think that Nolan is leaning more in the vocal direction. Like, would this be easier in some ways for the singers? How would that help the singers? What's interesting, since we are coming close to the end of our allotted time, and I get to remind and invite you to come Friday for the very interesting talk we have by Wendy Heller, who's going to talk about listening to the female voice in Bach cantatas. And I feel, if it doesn't come up in her main presentation, that I think our questions may start to look at this more in a vocal direction, because tonight has been very much on an instrumental side. But I would just say that there's a number of factors. One is some of the things Ryan said about we have modern voices and we have modern trained singers. All of our singers, because you have to be very well trained to sing Bach at this level, have a setup that allows them to sing much later music as well as Bach, right? Even the Baroque specialists are all able to pivot and sing, Mozart and Schubert and Brahms and, Harbison and other modern composers. There are also questions about hormones and puberty and, the other physical things that we can't know about how singers sang and what their techniques were. But one thing that I think we modern singers are constrained by the music is we must discover how to create a light sound, especially for the male voices at the top of the range, and for all voices when singing co-repertoire. So techniques that we may not have learned in music school, we must teach ourselves or find out how to learn to do them, right? And that then opens a door to pitch at 440, where using your normal setup, you feel like you're strangling, say, but with a lighter mechanism and inviting a setup, technical setup as a singer, you can function very, very beautifully and effectively at what we call modern pitch, and presumably solve the problems, like all of the people up on stage are saying, I have problems, I have to solve them, I've got this instrument in my hand, I'm going to figure out what I need to do. And singers are doing the same thing. So I feel like there's a lovely synergy between our panel this evening and the conversation that we look forward to on Friday nights. So please come back.